Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be going into the 1920s and the economic, social, um, political ideology of this time. So, starting off, you know, America just got out of World War One, and there were a lot of progressive reforms in America going on at this time. To start off the 1920s, probably the biggest thing is the 18th Amendment. Now, the 18th Amendment essentially bans the production and sale of alcohol. And this was brought about because of specifically one man. There's a guy named Billy Sunday. He was a former baseball player, former alcoholic, turned sober, and was really a kind of a preacher and said, "Hey, you know what? 50% of crime can be linked to alcohol." There's a lot of women's groups that say, "Yeah, alcohol is bad and promotes domestic violence." So yeah, Congress passes the 18th Amendment in 1919, and America is now sober. That doesn't mean that they liked it, right? We had this whole gangster crime syndicate that leads to the practice of bootlegging, right? So this is going to be privately, secretively manufacturing alcohol and selling it, moving it around, and this really did create some type of an organized crime system. Now these markets became very dangerous, right? You had gangsters that were uh, had specific territories. They had these large networks of crime, and rivalries, murders became very commonplace because of bootlegging and the 18th Amendment. Because after all, people wanted to have their drinks. Regular citizens, they still saw it as, you know what, this is a dumb policy, but we have to figure out ways around it. And so various businesses opened up things called speakeasies. These are bars that operate illegally. They're going to be selling alcohol underground. Um, at one point, there was like 4,000 speakeasies and 15,000 bootleggers just in Boston alone. Now you couldn't just go into a speakeasy; you had to have some type of membership card or some type of password to enter. And they were they weren't just for regular citizens or criminals. I mean, you had judges, police officers that would also go here as well. A lot of people saw the 18th Amendment as kind of a joke. They said, yeah, we're still going to do it. So stop us if you want." And they tried, and it really didn't work out too well. But this new era, right? So the 1920s is really going to be a time of change, time of progressivism, time of moral and social changes among specifically women, right? So there's a small population that you guys have probably heard of called the flapper, right? Now the flappers are these women who cut their hair short and wear short dresses, and this really wasn't accepted before this. This was kind of promiscuous, right? So these young women go out and drink and smoke and dance in risque ways, and it really was a conflict of traditional American ethics, and especially kind of made a lot of parents and elders of the country a little upset. But it's really just this new era for women, right? During World War One, they were expected to step up and take on the roles of men, traditionally men, in factories and businesses to take care of the war effort. So once all that ended, they saw um, disposable income, and they said, you know what, we don't need to be within these social norms. Now, not all women were flappers, obviously, but the style became very popular, and a lot of women cut their hair short. Now, they weren't as crazy and risque as flappers, but they definitely saw themselves as more than just wives and daughters. They started working in uh, more and more businesses, having better jobs than just maybe being a seamstress in a factory. You know, they were working as receptionists, secretaries, um, but they were very much getting their foot in the door, which eventually would be a very good thing. Now, in the 20s, also known as the Roaring 20s, it's a lot of progressive growth. Like I said, you have women stepping out of social norms. And there was a movement known as the women's suffrage movement. Now, that doesn't mean women are suffering, right? That suffrage is the right to vote, so it's women's right to vote movement, right? And now it did start as early as 1820, but really didn't pick up steam until the 1920s. Um, w- uh, uh, it wasn't a huge movement, but there were enough women to get things done. So on August 26th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. It was passed in Congress um, by a two-thirds majority and became part of our Constitution. So now women can vote. Now, not all women wanted to vote because at the time, all voters were required to serve on something called bucket duty. So they had to be volunteer firefighters. And so when the women's suffrage movement passed and the 19th Amendment passed, a lot of women didn't register to vote because they didn't want to do that. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case. Women did not have to go on bucket duty, but is what it is. Now, there is a social and economic split between this new progressive movement and traditional ideology, and we see this in big cities, right? Also, in these urban communities, you see a lot of progressivism, but in rural communities, they want to keep things pretty traditional, right? And farms and these other rural areas are going to become pretty stressed economically because um, industry in urban areas were taking the place of farms and other things. So over the next several years, about 6 million people say, "You know what, we can't do this anymore," and they move to the city, trying to find um, jobs that are a little bit better paying. And this is kind of a second wave of urbanization. It does cause an influx of skilled workers, and public schools are going to start pumping out students that will be um, educated in skills and knowledge that they need to be successful in an urban community. Before this, you learned your family trade and you worked on a farm or you did whatever your family did. But now we're putting kids into schools and they are growing and getting higher and better paying jobs. That's why you're in school, is to get a higher and better paying job at the end of the day. But there is a divide, right? Um, and we even see this now. There's this an ideological divide on what America should be. And now cities are going to thrive and they're going to accept these social changes and enjoy them. But rural areas are still going to have these older practices. Um, there's this thing called secularism, and these cities and the progressives are going to really enjoy this, right? So you're going to see changes in moralities and manners throughout the city, right? People are going to be acting a little crazy, going out dancing and drinking and smoking and all this other stuff. Well, on the rural areas, people are like, yeah, we don't want to do this. What the cities are doing are immoral and dangerous, and we don't want our kids growing up like that. So there is a split between ideologies between the rural communities and the urban communities. And along with that, it really goes back to faith and religion, right? So there's this thing called fundamentalism, right? And fundamentalism is the traditional beliefs in Judeo-Christian faiths. Um, it's going to be challenged with these new ideas, right? So science and technology are taking a larger and larger part in everyday life, and with that, it's going to question a lot of things that religion teaches. Along with war and widespread problems, modern society was starting to question, is there actually a God, right? We see the world war, how would God let this happen? So you really see a lot of interesting stuff going on. Now, kind of the biggest point and the national stage as far as a war on fundamentalism is something called the Scopes trial. Now, in 1925, there's a Tennessee science teacher, his name is John T. Scopes. He challenges state law by teaching the theory of evolution. Nowadays we teach evolution in biology class because it's a theory that should be taught. But back then it was seen as a slight against religion, and people didn't like it. So he actually got in quite a bit of trouble for teaching evolution in his school. So he decided to challenge this law, saying it's unconstitutional to deny him as an individual his own religious freedom just because he doesn't practice, you know, a Judeo-Christian faith. He should still have the right to teach what he believes. Now, the trial did intrigue a lot of people, right? There was, you know, parties in front of the courthouse because people were so interested in this thing. It was actually the first ever broadcasted over the radio um, trial, and people really, really intrigued. So it lasted for 10 days, and it really just shed a light on the conflict of traditional beliefs and these new secular ideologies. Um, but yeah, big kind of thing. So let's look at post World War One economics in America. So the world's recovering from World War One, but America found itself as an economic power. Again, I said before, we didn't have any damage really done to our industries or our infrastructure in the United States, so it allowed us to surpass most other countries who had to rebuild after World War One. So America becomes this just economic powerhouse which rises the standard of living. Right, the standard of living is the degree in wealth and material comfort that a person has in their community. What are the basic things that people have? It doesn't mean that you have enough to survive. It means how are you living, right? How many TVs do you have? How many cars do you have? And that's kind of standard of living. It's the average way people live. And it was something that really helped with this is the credit system. Now we know what credit cards are. It's a way of buying something now and paying for it later. And this really became a new way of buying in the 1920s. This idea would be that you purchase something and then you would pay installments with interest until that item's paid off. So it really became popular in the 1920s to buy on credit. Banks are going to offer the country's first home mortgages, meaning you can buy a home on credit. You're going to pay it off. This is what we call a mortgage. Um, car manufacturers, all that stuff are going to allow people to buy things and then pay them off over time. Now, eventually the credit system would kind of fail the United States. We'd have to fix it, but we're not there yet. So hold off. Um, in my last video, I very briefly talked about the Great Migration, and this is a big deal. Having African Americans moving from the north or the south to the north. And really, that's because of the Jim Crow laws in the South. This was very um, detrimental to the African American community. They couldn't vote. They had to sit in separate waiting rooms, separate areas of buses, all that stuff. But in the North, African Americans had an opportunity. They had an opportunity to go work. They had an opportunity to own their own home. And so you see a lot of people, upwards around 6 million African Americans, move to the North um, during this period. Factory jobs are in high demand. In fact, Henry Ford is one of the highest employers of African Americans because he's like, I don't care what your skin color is, I care that the job gets done. So he paid them very well. Um, in the North, the African Americans were able to get equal pay. They weren't discriminated against too much based on their ethnicity, um, and they started living a better life. And as this better life continued, we would see them enter something called the Harlem Renaissance. This Harlem was the center of African American music, culture, literacy, and it's this rebirth of ideology, not rebirth of the arts for African Americans in Harlem at this time. There's this new view on what the world was and what it could be. Um, it was predominantly African American, Harlem was, and it became home for some very famous black artists. And out of this is why we have the Harlem Renaissance. Um, People like Langston Hughes, Dorothy West, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, they're going to be these forefathers of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, prior to the 1920s, the only American heroes are going to be found in wars, right? You're a hero if you fought in a war. But this new era, this new 1920s, this new uh, decade, everyday Americans started to separate themselves as American heroes. Adventurers, sports stars, risk takers, they started becoming viable role models for kids at the time. A lot of these people living in the 1920s, especially young people, really didn't know the pain of war. They saw, Amelia Earhart and okay, he was named Charles Lindbergh. These great adventurers that were just big, larger than life, and these became the heroes that people looked up to, not necessarily war heroes anymore. Also, in the 1920s, workers are able to buy stuff. Like I said, they have this credit system, and plus, with all the jobs in the cities, they have disposable income. They can buy things, and companies are going to start advertising with billboards and commercials on radio, and we see a huge influx of people spending money. And if you want to have a successful economy, you have to spend money. So America becomes more and more powerful, and a result of that is because of their purchasing power, right? The more people buy, the more that companies need to make, and the more they make, the more people they need to employ. The more people they employ, the more money those people can make, and they can spend on the goods. So with the increase in wages, this also would increase people's opportunities to invest their money into what we know as the stock market. Now, stock market is a place where you can invest into a company and benefit for their success. So, if I invested into Amazon back in like 1992 when it was dirt cheap, I'd be doing pretty well for myself because it's gotten more and more powerful. Now, stocks are a portion of that company, and you technically own part of that company if you own stocks in that company. And so we see things going pretty well for people. Um, Now, there was some things that people didn't see coming, especially banks, economists, and that was with the availability of loans, people could invest in the stock market. This is known as over speculation. You're going to borrow money to invest money to hopefully make that money back plus some on top, then pay your loan back. Well, the economy was a little bit unstable in the United States. There wasn't a lot of wealth distribution. Yeah, you had a big middle class, but most of the money lied with the most wealthy. But people were still investing. You take a loan and you invest. And with so much money being invested, none of that money actually reaches the economy, right? The more money that you put into the stock market, there's less money in the economy itself. So there's less and less money changing hands, people buying on credit, people buying things they really can't afford. The economy can't last. So 1928, everyone's like, "Oh man, the economy is awesome and our future looks bright," right? And that's in 1928 because they don't know what the future holds. The stock market had an excess of $25 billion in the stock market, and people were like, "Yeah, we're doing awesome." So more and more people invest in the stock market. They take out loans. They put in the stock market, but that means less money is changing hands. Employers are able to raise wages and give benefits like dental and health to people. And the middle class became pretty comfortable and they were taking advantage of all this stuff. They were able to invest. But this big boom of manufacturing eventually is going to hit a wall. So as the rise of manufacturing continued, the products that they were making sold less and less. If you think about it, like owning a car, like Henry Ford made the Model T for like 20 years, the exact same car, and it was pretty cheap to buy. So people started buying cars, but they didn't need a new one. So they continued producing cars at the same rate that they had the last few years, but people don't need them anymore. So they start seeing a drop off in things being bought, right? They don't need People don't need to buy radios. They don't need to buy cars because they have them already. And nothing really new is coming out. So it's not incentivizing people to go out and buy new things. But by March of 1928, the Dow Jones had risen to an all-time high of 381 points, which is Back then, it might have been high. Now it's up to 24,000. It's pretty crazy. And the amount of millionaires in the United States was higher than ever before. Now, come to October 23rd, 1928, stocks all of a sudden dropped by 21 points in 1 hour. And this freaked people out. So, next day, on October 24th, a lot of investors start selling their stocks off because, like, I don't want to lose my money in the stock market. And as a result of people selling off their stocks, you see a drop in all stock prices, not just a few, all of them. So within a day, the stock market loses about $3 billion. Now, President at the time, Herbert Hoover, says, "You know what? This is an anomaly. It's weird. Things are fine. Continue business as usual. Continue doing what you're doing." Um, Herbert Hoover comes out and says, "You know what? Keep it keep it normal. Nothing wrong." Now, a bunch of banks tried to pool their money together and reinvest in the stock market and stabilize it. And so they did that. And it did stabilize for a few days. However, on October 29th, there's $16.4 million worth of shares sold in the stock market. This ended up losing about $30 billion in the stock market. Um, Now, it is important to note that not everyone was in the stock market. Well, the business owners and wealthy people were. These are people who own the factories, and all of a sudden they were bankrupt. So all their employees now had no money. So with no money available, businesses stopped producing, which means people stopped working, and it was a really big ripple effect um, at the end of this whole thing. Now, just to wrap up, um, right about the beginning of the 1930s, 1933, Congress goes ahead and gets rid of the 18th Amendment by passing the 21st Amendment, which ends prohibition. So people could drink. So everybody's broke, but at least you can drink now. So we'll look at the Great Depression here coming up on our next video. I know this one was a little bit longer, but bear with me. This stuff's going to help you. See you next time.